The auctioneer brought the gavel down at $425 on a cold, clear November morning in 2005 at the Naugatuck Valley Industrial Estate Auction outside Waterbury, Connecticut, and the man in the black wool fedora under the open auction tent let out a hard-barked laugh from deep in his chest that turned every Brass Valley shop hand along the wrought iron fence. Frankie Ciampi was 51, 5'10", and barrel-chested. Black hair slicked back from a high-tan forehead under a black wool fedora pulled low, a thin black pencil mustache trimmed close, hollow weather-tan cheeks above a clean-shaven jaw, sharp dark eyes hidden behind dark wraparound sunglasses, a small gold tooth. He wore a 3/4-length camel-hair overcoat open over a dark charcoal gray 3-piece wool suit, a starched white dress shirt, a narrow dark green silk necktie, polished black leather Oxford dress shoes, and a thick gold pinky ring set with an onyx stone on his left hand. Frankie had run the Naugatuck Valley contract recovery operation out of a brass yard backlot on South Main Street in Waterbury for 22 years and had been buying every old wrecker in the Brass Valley since 1989. He had told the auctioneer privately he would have offered the estate $100 for the 1950 Mack LJ because the high snub-nose hood was creased from a 1989 winch cable parting. The 24-year-old shop mechanic at the back of the bidder's line in the deeply faded dark navy quilted vest had just outbid Frankie for $425 against his casual $80 opening shot, and Frankie was making sure the Brass Valley shop hands understood the joke. Anders Stromberg folded the auction slip into the inside pocket of his quilted vest and walked through the cold cinder gravel of the Naugatuck Valley backlot to the truck. The Mack LJ was 23 feet of long-nose conventional cab heavy iron with the distinctive high snub-nose hood and the chrome bulldog hood ornament still standing proud on the front of the long hood. The cab painted a faded Mack maple brown oxidized to a chalky tea brown along the body panels and brass yard verdigris green along the lower edges of the doors from 16 years, sitting in a Brass Valley backlot. The chrome Mack letters across the front of the long hood tarnished to a dull pewter. Both round chrome side cab fender mirrors snapped at the brackets. The original Holmes 525 wrecker boom with a hand-cranked single-drum winch mounted on the rear deck listing 2 degrees right, with a frayed cable and a heavy steel winch base plate visible below the winch drum. The wooden cargo deck planks rotted through, 3 of the 6 tires flat, and the word junk spray-painted in flaking Valley Mill gray block letters across the driver's door. A 6-inch crease ran across the upper edge of the high snub-nose hood, where a parted winch cable had whipped back in 1989. Anders had grown up 4 miles east of where this truck had last been parked on a quiet street in the Watertown section of Waterbury. His grandfather, Lars Stromberg, was waiting at the trailer. Lars was 78, a retired Scoville brass foundry pattern maker who had worked the Scoville manufacturing pattern shop in Waterbury for 41 years between 1948 and 1989, 5'10", lean and erect with broad, bony shoulders and a slight stoop, snow-white hair under a faded charcoal wool watch cap, pulled low, a thick white mustache, deep, watery sage-gray eyes in a Connecticut industrial face, large knotted hands with pale verdigris stains in the knuckle creases from 40 years of brass pattern work. A short-stem briar pipe sat unlit between his teeth. He wore a dark navy quilted vest over a faded red and black plaid wool flannel shirt buttoned to the throat, dark gray heavy twill work pants held up with thick brown leather suspenders, scuffed brown leather lace-up snow boots, and a plain, dark brown leather belt with a worn brass buckle stamped with the small Scoville manufacturing shield. Lars set one liver-spotted hand on the rusted bumper of the Mack and stood there a long minute. He spoke quietly. He said, "Son, you bought Knute Engman's old LJ." Knute Engman had run Engman Brass Valley Recovery out of a brick shop on South Main Street in Waterbury from 1969 until the cable parting, working the wet brass yard rail spurs and the tight switchbacks above the Naugatuck River, pulling stuck Brass Valley foundry supply trucks off back grades of the Scoville and American brass yards, and overturned mill supply trucks out of wet September thunderstorms above New Haven. He had built the heavy steel winch base plate himself onto the Mack's rear deck in 1976, with the help of two welders from the Scoville pattern shop on a long Labor Day weekend. He had married a New Haven girl named Maeve Hartley in 1962, and they had a daughter, Annalisa, born in 1965. Knute had died in September of 1989. He had been rigging a stuck locomotive recovery on a New Haven railroad spur in the rear of the American brass yard at 3 in the afternoon when a worn winch cable parted under load and the recoiling cable struck Knute across the chest. He had died at the New Haven hospital 2 hours later. He was 59. Annalisa was 24 and away at graduate school at Yale. The Mack had been recovered up out of the brass yard rail spur by another wrecker out of Bridgeport and parked behind the Engman shop on South Main Street. Maeve had paid the property tax on the shop for 16 years until she remarried in 2005 and moved to Mystic. The lot was let go to the county and the inventory consigned to the Naugatuck Valley Industrial Estate auction. The Mack sat in the back of the lot until the November sale. Anders had been at the auction because his grandfather had heard from a Scoville retiree that Knute Engman's truck was finally being sold. They winched the LJ onto Anders's borrowed flatbed trailer. Frankie Ciampi stood under the open auction tent in his black wool fedora and watched, the dark wraparound sunglasses still on his face, and as Anders pulled out, he called across the cinder gravel that when the boy was ready to admit defeat, the Naugatuck Valley Contract Recovery Operation would haul the LJ to the Bridgeport scrap pier for $100 cash. Anders did not answer. Lars climbed into the cab of the trailer truck, and they drove the 7 miles east on Connecticut Route 6 to Lars's red brick foundry shop garage behind a small brick bungalow in the Watertown section of Waterbury. The dead Mack, rocking behind them on the cold pavement, the Holmes 525 boom pointing at the cold gray November Connecticut sky like a bent finger. The restoration would take 19 years. Nobody knew that on the drive east. Anders worked his day job at a heavy truck shop in Naugatuck during the week and drove 10 minutes east on Route 6 to Lars's brick garage every Saturday and most Sundays. They started with the hood crease, the high snub-nose hood crease from the 1989 cable parting had bent 2 inches inward, and they cut out the crease, welded in fresh 20-gauge sheet, and prepared the hood for paint over 3 weekends. They pulled the Mack Thermodyne END 672 inline-6 diesel engine out of the truck and tore it down on a stand. The bearings were salvageable, the crank true, the head needed a careful regrind. They pulled the 5-speed Mack manual and pressed new bushings into the shift tower. The first long Connecticut winter went into the engine and into stories about Knute Engman. Lars told Anders about the night in 1979 when Knute pulled a stuck Scoville brass supply truck out of a Naugatuck Creek at -6 and refused payment except for a length of cured Watertown kielbasa. He told Anders about the morning in 1983 when Knute hauled a snapped D8 out of a Brass Valley rail cut and let the contractor pay him in 2 cords of seasoned white oak. He told stories about Maeve Engman's blueberry buckle. The second year, they sandblasted the brass yard-stained frame down to clean steel. By the 5th year, the cab came off. In the 7th year, Lars slowed. He had a small heart attack in February and was at the Waterbury hospital for 10 days. He came home thinner and quieter, but his hands still worked. He told Anders the truck would wait. By the 9th year, the Mack was a roller. In the 11th year, Anders's son was born and the work paused for a month. By the 14th year, Lars sat more than he stood. He worked from a folding chair beside the wood stove, the watch cap pulled low, the briar pipe between his teeth, pointing at what to do next. Through all those years, Frankie's polished black 1988 Lincoln Mark 7 drove past the foot of Lars's brick walk on Route 6 on the way to a Bridgeport recovery call, the black wool fedora visible through the open driver's window. The Mark 7 always slowed at the bottom of the walk, but never quite turned in. By the 15th year, the Mack was painted. They had wet sanded and primed and laid down a deep, glossy Mack maple brown that matched a faded snapshot Lars had of the truck from 1976. And they had masked off the driver's door with blue painter's tape around a rectangle where the flaking Valley Mill gray junk paint still showed through, and they had left it there. Anders did not know why. He just left it. By the 17th year, the Holmes 525 boom was rebuilt with a fresh aircraft-grade single-drum cable. By the 19th year, the Mack was nearly whole. They had not yet pulled the heavy steel winch base plate off the rear deck to inspect the deck steel and bolt pattern beneath for fresh stainless mounting hardware. The winch base plate was the last thing on the list because Lars always said, you start with what makes the truck move and you finish with what holds the winch when she pulls a hard cable. On a cold, clear morning of September the 8th of the 19th year, Anders pulled into Lars's brick garage with a fresh set of stainless winch base plate bolts and a 1/2-inch socket. He was 42. The dark blonde at his temples had gone steady silver. The small white scar across his right wrist from a wire feed welder in 2015 was a faint line, and his hands had the thickness of a man who had spent half his life under hoods. Lars was 97. He sat on his folding wooden chair beside the brick garage wood stove with a heavy plaid wool blanket over his knees, the faded charcoal wool watch cap pulled low, the short-stem briar pipe between his teeth. Anders unbolted the heavy steel winch base plate from the rear deck of the Mack and lifted it free. He started to wire brush the deck steel beneath the base plate for fresh stainless hardware, and he stopped. There was a small hand-welded steel pocket bolted to the underside of the winch base plate where the base plate had sat against the deck steel for 49 years. The pocket was 4 inches by 6 inches by 1 inch deep, and the weld bead was hand-applied. Anders set down the wire brush. He took a 1/2-inch socket and unbolted the pocket from the base plate underside. The pocket came free in his hand. He carried the pocket to the workbench under the clip-on lamp and slit the soldered seam with a heated putty knife and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in 2 layers of waxed canvas bound with brown twine, were 4 things. There was a tight roll of folded $20 bills wrapped with a piece of brown twine, 90 bills in 1980s Federal Reserve paper, totaling $1,800. There was a small brass master pattern maker's vernier caliper with a fine engraved Scoville Manufacturing logo along the brass face, and the words Scoville Manufacturing Company / Master Pattern Shop / 1922 stamped across the brass base above 3 small initials. There was a small black and white photograph mounted on stiff paperboard showing a small girl of about 8 in a wool toque sitting on the granite base of the Waterbury green clock tower. With the brick brass valley buildings rising behind her, the date October 1974 written on the back in pencil, and there was a folded single sheet of plain yellowed lined paper, the creases brittle, the ink faded but legible. Anders unfolded it. The handwriting was small and careful and slanted slightly to the right. The letter was dated September the 14th of 1989. It read, "To my Annalisa, the cash is for whatever a young woman needs at 24 when the brass valley cannot hold her. The caliper is your grandfather Sigurd's. He was a master pattern maker at the Scoville Manufacturing Pattern Shop in downtown Waterbury from 1922 until he retired in 1962, and he gave the caliper to me on my 18th birthday in 1948. The photograph is of you the morning your grandfather walked you down to the Waterbury Green to see the clock tower strike noon for the first time. I am welding this pocket under the winch base plate because the New Haven rail spur recovery cable on the American brass yard has been showing fresh fray every Monday for a month, and I do not want anything lost if the cable parts on the next hard pull. The truck is yours when you are old enough to drive her without breaking her. Your father, Knute Engman, Waterbury, Connecticut, September 14th, 1989. Anders sat on the workbench. He read the letter twice. He handed it to his grandfather, and Lars held it in both hands and read it once and set it down. He said quietly, "Knute wrote this 6 days before the cable parted at the brass yard." The girl never knew. They drove east to Old Saybrook the next Saturday. Lars had called a Scoville retiree whose nephew kept the Old Saybrook Historical Society records, and the nephew had given them a current address for Annalise Engman Hartley on Main Street in Old Saybrook. They drove east on Interstate 84 and south on Interstate 95 under a clear, cold November Connecticut sky, and parked in front of a small clapboard storefront with a hand-painted wooden sign above the door reading Engman Hartley Antiquarian Maps. The woman who came out of the storefront in a soft charcoal silk blend cardigan was 59. She had Knute Engman's broad shoulders and her father's deep, watery, sage-gray eyes. She wore a soft charcoal silk blend cardigan over a faded burgundy cotton blouse, slim charcoal trousers, polished oxblood leather low-heel ankle boots, a thin silver compass rose pendant on a thin silver chain at her throat, and a thin silver wedding band on her left ring finger. Lars spoke first. He said, "Ma'am, I knew your father. He worked on his Mack in my brick garage in 1981. My grandson here bought the LJ at the Naugatuck Valley estate auction 19 years ago, and we have been restoring her ever since. and we found something welded under her winch base plate that belongs to you." Annalise's face changed. She brought them into a small map shop reading room, and they sat at a long maple research table, and Anders set the 4 items down one at a time. The cash first, then the brass caliper, then the photograph. He saved the letter for last. Annalisa picked up the brass caliper. She turned it slowly between her fingers and read the engraving on the brass base. She said her grandfather, Sigurd, had been a master pattern maker at the Scoville Manufacturing Pattern Shop from 1922 until 1962, that the family had been told the caliper had been buried with him in 1968, and that she had been looking for it for 30 years. She picked up the photograph. She held it for a long time. She read the letter twice. She did not cry until the second reading. She asked finally if she could see the truck. They drove her west to Lars's brick garage the next morning. Annalise walked slowly around the Mack 3 times in the open bay. She ran her hand along the chrome Mack letters across the long hood and the polished chrome bulldog hood ornament. She stood at the driver's door where the flaking Valley Mill grade junk was still masked off in blue tape. She turned to Anders and asked the price. Anders looked at his grandfather. Lars laid both hands on his knees and said, "Ma'am, the truck is yours, but not the way you mean. We are going to finish her. We are going to paint over the door so the junk is gone, and then we are going to drive her down Route 6 to South Main Street in Waterbury and park her at the empty brick lot where Engman Brass Valley Recovery stood until September of 1989. And we are going to paint your father's name on the door in clean white, the way he had it in 1969. The boy paid $425 at auction. The truck is his on the paper. The work is his by the doing. But the name on the door belongs to your father and your grandfather and you." They finished the Mack through that winter. Annalisa drove west from Old Saybrook every other Sunday. On the morning of May the 11th of the 20th year, they rolled the LJ out of Lars's brick garage under a clear blue Connecticut sky and drove her in convoy west on Route 6 to South Main Street in Waterbury and parked her facing the empty brick lot where Engman Brass Valley Recovery had stood until September of 1989. Anders handed Annalisa a small can of deep maple brown paint and a 1-inch brush. Annalisa climbed up on the running board and painted out the flaking Valley Mill grade junk on the driver's door. She waited an hour. She opened a can of clean white lettering paint, and in her father's careful slant, she painted across the door, in clean, clear letters, Engman Brass Valley Recovery, established 1969, old enough to drive her without breaking her. She stepped down. A polished black 1988 Lincoln Mark 7 went by on South Main Street. Frankie Chumpy was driving with the dark wraparound sunglasses still on his face. He slowed almost to a stop. He looked at the Mack, at the empty brick lot with the maple brown door and the clean white lettering. He looked at the 4 people on the sidewalk. He did not laugh. He drove on. The Mack sits on South Main Street in Waterbury today, and the sign on the door reads, Engman Brass Valley Recovery, established 1969. Annalisa runs the antiquarian map shop on Main Street in Old Saybrook. The $1,800 sits in a small lockbox at her shop office. The 1922 Scoville Master Pattern Maker's caliper sits beside it. The 1974 photograph is framed above her map restoration bench. The letter is in a small fireproof safe in her closet. She reads it once a year on the 14th of September. If you ever see an old Mack LJ parked along South Main Street in Waterbury with the words Engman Brass Valley Recovery painted on the door in clean white, slow down. Roll the window down and listen. There is a story in that truck that a tow boss in a black wool fedora would have hauled to the Bridgeport scrap pier for $100, and the work was always for the daughter. Subscribe to Iron Hook Stories for a new story every day. Thank you for watching.